The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of the sprawling estate, casting long, golden fingers across the polished marble floors that the young woman had spent hours cleaning. She moved with a practiced, silent grace, her dark blue made uniform crisp and perfectly ironed, a stark contrast to the opulence that surrounded her every day. At 28, she had learned the art of becoming invisible, a ghost in the halls of power who saw everything but was never truly seen. The mansion belonged to a man whose name was whispered with both reverence and terror across the city, a figure of immense influence in the Korean underworld who lived behind walls of glass and steel. She dusted the heavy mahogany furniture in the grand foyer, her head bowed, her eyes focused on the rhythmic movement of her cloth, yet her ears were always tuned to the subtle shifts in the house's atmosphere. There was a peculiar stillness to the air today, a heavy tension that seemed to vibrate in the very walls, signaling that something momentous was about to unfold. She had grown up in a world far removed from this luxury, a place where survival meant understanding the languages of those who sought to remain hidden. Her parents had been travelers, laborers who moved across borders, and from them, she had inherited a gift for tongues that no one in this house suspected she possessed. As she worked, she watched the guards through the corner of her eye, men in sharp black suits with earpieces and cold, vacant stares who stood like statues at every entrance. They viewed her as nothing more than a fixture of the house, a piece of living furniture that required no more thought than a lamp or a rug. This anonymity was her shield, allowing her to exist in the periphery of a dangerous world without ever being pulled into its center. She knew the schedules, the moods, and the unspoken rules of the household, navigating the complex social hierarchy with a quiet humility that masked a sharp, observant mind. The boss, a man of iron will and few words, was preparing for a high-stakes meeting that would determine the future of his empire, and the entire staff was on edge, sensing the gravity of the day. She felt a flicker of unease in her chest, a premonition that the order she worked so hard to maintain was about to be shattered by a hidden truth. Every step she took was deliberate, every motion calculated to avoid drawing attention, yet she could not shake the feeling that her silence was becoming a burden she could no longer carry. The house was a fortress, but even fortresses have cracks, and she was the only one positioned to see the light shining through the darkness of a brewing conspiracy. The shadows lengthened in the hallway as two guards, recently hired to bolster the security detail for the upcoming summit, stood near a decorative suit of armor, their voices low and urgent. They did not speak in the harsh, clipped tones of the local dialect, nor did they use the formal Korean that the boss demanded of his inner circle. Instead, they spoke in a rapid, melodic Mandarin that they assumed no one in this household could possibly comprehend. The maid, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain as she polished the brass handles of the garden doors, felt her heart hammer against her ribs as the familiar sounds of her childhood language reached her ears. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, as the true nature of their conversation began to crystallize in her mind, revealing a betrayal so deep it threatened to upend everything. They were not discussing security protocols or the logistics of the boss's departure. They were discussing the exact placement of a device beneath the passenger seat of the armored sedan waiting in the driveway. Their words were cold and clinical, stripped of any humanity, as they joked about the explosion that would soon turn the luxury vehicle into a charred skeleton of metal and glass. The taller guard, a man with a jagged scar running down his neck, whispered about the payment they would receive from a rival faction once the job was completed and the boss was erased from the board. The maid's hands trembled, the polishing cloth slipping from her fingers and fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird, but she dared not move to retrieve it. She realized then that the life of the man she served, a man who had never spoken a kind word to her, but who represented the only stability she had ever known, was ticking away in seconds and minutes. The guards were confident in their deception, believing their secret safe behind the barrier of a foreign tongue, never imagining that the shy woman in the blue dress was decoding every word of their murderous intent. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the weight of the secret pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain of lead. If she spoke, she risked everything, her job, her safety, and perhaps her life, but if she remained silent, she would be an accomplice to a cold-blooded assassination. The moral clarity she had always prided herself on was being tested in the crucible of fear, and she knew she had only moments to decide which path to take. She looked out at the driveway where the sleek black car sat idling, a predatory beast waiting to consume its master, and she knew she could not let the darkness win without a fight. The boss emerged from his private study, his presence commanding the room with an effortless authority that made the air feel thin and electric. He was a man who moved with the predatory grace of a leopard, his eyes sharp and discerning, missing nothing, except, perhaps, the silent scream echoing in the soul of his most humble servant. He adjusted his silk tie and nodded to his lead bodyguard, a loyal man named Minho who had served him for a decade, unaware that the snakes were already in the grass. The maid stood by the exit, her head bowed so low that her chin touched her collarbone, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron into tight, anxious knots. She could hear the guards who had been whispering in Chinese moving toward the car, their faces masks of professional stoicism that hid the treachery beneath. As the boss walked toward the grand entrance, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats on the marble, the maid felt a sudden, explosive surge of courage that defied her naturally timid nature. She knew that once he stepped into that car, the world as she knew it would end in fire and smoke, and the innocent people who worked in this house would be left to pick up the pieces of a shattered legacy. She stepped forward, breaking the unspoken rule that a servant must never initiate contact, her voice a fragile thread of sound that barely pierced the heavy silence of the foyer. "Sir," she whispered, the word feeling foreign and heavy in her mouth. "Please, you must listen to me." The boss stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing in confusion as he turned to look at the woman he had likely never addressed by name. The guards narrowed their eyes, their hands moving instinctively toward the holsters hidden beneath their jackets, sensing a disruption in their meticulously crafted plan. The maid felt the weight of their collective gaze, a crushing pressure that threatened to silence her once more, but she thought of the words she had heard, the cold, calculated talk of fire and death, and she found her voice. "The car is not safe," she said, her tone gaining a desperate strength that surprised even herself. "I heard them. I heard what they said when they thought no one was listening." The air in the room turned to ice as the boss stared at her, his expression unreadable, a wall of stone that she had to break through if he was to survive the morning. Minho stepped between the boss and the maid, his hand raised in a gesture of caution, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of an immediate threat. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated with suspicion and protective instinct. The maid did not flinch, her gaze fixed on the boss, her eyes pleading for him to see the truth behind her fear. "The new guards," she said, gesturing toward the men standing by the door who were now visibly sweating despite the cool air of the mansion. They spoke in Chinese. "They think I am just a maid who knows nothing, but I understood every word of their plan to destroy you." The two guards in question took a step back, their faces pale, their hands hovering near their weapons as they realized their linguistic shield had been shattered by the most unlikely of adversaries. The boss looked from the maid to the guards, his mind working with the speed of a master strategist, connecting the dots of their sudden arrival and their unusual behavior over the past few days. "They put something under your seat," she continued, her voice trembling but clear, "an explosive device meant to trigger the moment you leave the gates." The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull the breath from the room as the gravity of her accusations settled over everyone present. The boss walked slowly toward the two guards, his movements deliberate and terrifying, his eyes never leaving theirs as he searched for the flicker of guilt that would confirm the maid's story. He saw it in the way their eyes darted toward the exit, in the way their hands shook, and in the sheer, naked terror that now defined their features. He turned back to the maid, a new light in his eyes, a mixture of shock, respect, and a profound realization that his life had been saved by the person he had overlooked for years. "Check the car," the boss commanded Minho, his voice a cold blade that cut through the tension. "And do not let these men leave my sight until I am satisfied." The maid felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense it made her knees weak, but she remained standing, a witness to the unfolding justice that she had set in motion with a few whispered words. The tension reached a breaking point as Minho and a team of loyal security officers swarmed the armored sedan, their movements precise and urgent as they performed a sweep of the vehicle's undercarriage. The two traitorous guards, realizing their mission had failed and their lives were forfeit, made a desperate break for the door, but they were tackled to the ground before they could even reach the threshold. The maid watched, her heart pounding in her ears, as the reality of the violence she had averted played out in front of her like a scene from a fever dream. Within minutes, Minho returned, his face grim as he held up a small, sophisticated electronic device that had been magnetically attached to the frame of the car directly beneath the passenger seat. The boss looked at the device, then at the men struggling in the grip of his loyal followers, and finally at the young woman in the dark blue dress who stood trembling in the center of the foyer. The power dynamic of the house had shifted in an instant. She was no longer the invisible servant, the ghost in the halls, but the savior who had stood between a powerful man and his grave. The boss walked over to her, his presence no longer intimidating but strangely grounding, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a fixture of his estate, but as a human being of extraordinary courage. "You saved my life," he said, the words quiet and heavy with a sincerity that she had never expected to hear from a man of his stature. The maid looked down at her hands, which were finally beginning to stop shaking, and she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a realization that her silence had been a choice, and her speech had been a triumph. The moral weight of the morning had been lifted, replaced by a profound understanding of the impact one person can have when they choose to act with integrity in the face of overwhelming danger. She had entered the room a shy maid, burdened by the secrets of a world she didn't belong to, but she would leave it as the woman who had rewritten the fate of an empire through the simple act of listening and the brave act of speaking. The sun continued to rise, casting a brilliant light over the estate, no longer a place of hidden shadows and whispered threats, but a place where a new kind of loyalty had been forged in the fire of a near disaster. The atmosphere in the grand foyer shifted from a site of potential carnage to a theater of cold, calculated justice. The boss stood over the two restrained men, his shadow stretching across the marble floor like a dark omen, while the maid remained anchored to her spot, her heart still racing with a mixture of adrenaline and profound disbelief. She watched as the men who had plotted murder were dragged away to a windowless room in the basement, their pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. The boss did not follow them. Instead, he remained with the woman in the blue uniform, his gaze intense and searching. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the ability to read people, yet he realized he had failed to see the most important person in his own home. He began to ask her questions, not with the interrogation style of a commander, but with the genuine curiosity of a man who had just discovered a hidden treasure. He asked how she knew the language, how long she had been listening, and why she had chosen to risk her life for him. She answered with a quiet honesty, explaining that her parents had been migrants who worked in the border towns, teaching her that understanding the enemy's tongue was the only true form of protection. She told him that she did not care for the politics of his world, but she could not stand by and watch a life be extinguished by cowardice and shadows. The boss listened in silence, his arms crossed over his chest, realizing that the loyalty he had tried to buy with high salaries and fear was nothing compared to the moral clarity of a woman who earned a fraction of his wealth. He saw the way her hands still trembled, the way she clutched her apron as if it were a shield, and he felt a rare surge of empathy for someone so far outside his social circle. The estate, once a place of cold transactions, suddenly felt different to him, as if the air had been cleared of a long-standing fog. He realized that his security was not a matter of walls and guns, but of the people who inhabited the spaces between them. The maid, sensing the intensity of his gaze, looked up and met his eyes, seeing for the first time the man behind the myth of the Mafia boss. In that moment of shared recognition, the barriers of class and power dissolved, leaving only two human beings connected by a shared brush with death. As the morning progressed, the mansion became a hive of activity, but the chaos was orderly and focused under the boss's sharp direction. He canceled his meetings for the day, realizing that his empire was under a more direct threat than any business rival could pose. He retreated to his secondary study, a smaller, more intimate room filled with books and old maps, and he requested that the maid join him there. She entered the room with a tray of tea, her old habits of service resurfacing even in this transformed reality, but he gestured for her to sit in one of the heavy leather chairs opposite his desk. It was an unprecedented request, a breaking of the final boundary between master and servant, and she sat on the edge of the cushion, her back straight and her eyes wide. He poured the tea himself, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than any words of gratitude he could have offered. "You have a gift," he said softly, the steam from the tea curling between them like a ghost. "You see things that others miss because they are too busy looking for their own reflection." He explained that he had lived his life expecting betrayal from his peers, but he had never expected salvation from someone he had treated as a shadow. The maid felt a warmth spreading through her chest, not just from the tea, but from the validation of her existence. She realized that her life of invisibility had ended the moment she spoke up, and while the future was now uncertain and potentially dangerous, she did not regret her choice. They talked for an hour, the boss asking for her observations on other members of the staff and the visitors who came and went. She spoke with a cautious precision, revealing the small inconsistencies she had noted over the months, the way a certain driver took longer routes, or how a delivery man seemed too interested in the security cameras. The boss took notes, his expression grim as he realized how much vital information he had ignored by overlooking the woman who cleaned his floors. He saw that she was not just a linguist, but a natural analyst, a person whose survival depended on her ability to read the world around her with unerring accuracy. The investigation into the bomb plot deepened as the day wore on, revealing a network of corruption that reached into the very heart of the boss's security firm. It became clear that the two guards were merely the tip of the spear, hired by a coalition of rivals who had grown tired of the boss's dominance in the region. The maid remained in the inner sanctum of the house, protected by Minho and his most trusted men, as the boss began the bloody work of purging the traitors from his organization. She felt a sense of unease as she heard the distant shouts and the heavy thud of doors closing, a reminder of the violent world she had momentarily stepped into. However, she also felt a strange sense of belonging, a feeling that she was no longer just a witness to history, but a participant in it. The boss returned to her late in the afternoon, his suit jacket removed and his sleeves rolled up, looking weary but more alive than she had ever seen him. He sat down across from her and told her that the threat had been neutralized, but the world would never be the same for either of them. "You cannot go back to being a maid," he said, his voice firm and final. "You know too much, and you have proven yourself too valuable to be wasted on dust and marble." He offered her a position as his personal advisor, a role that would involve monitoring communications and acting as a final filter for the information that reached his desk. It was a life of power and danger, a far cry from the quiet life she had led, but she saw the sincerity in his eyes and the desperate need for someone he could truly trust. She thought of her parents and the lessons they had taught her about the power of words, and she realized that this was the path she was meant to walk. She accepted the offer, not out of a desire for wealth or status, but out of a sense of duty to the man whose life she had saved and the new world they were building together. The transformation of the maid into a key figure within the organization happened with a quiet, efficient speed that mirrored the boss's own style. She was given a new wardrobe, sleek, professional suits that replaced the blue uniform, and a private office near the boss's own study. The rest of the staff looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, wondering how the shy woman they had ignored for years had suddenly become the most influential person in the house. She did not let the change in status go to her head. She remained the same observant, humble person she had always been, but now her observations were acted upon with the weight of the boss's authority. She spent her days listening to recordings, translating documents, and sitting in on meetings where her presence was a constant reminder to everyone that the boss had eyes and ears they could not see. The bond between the boss and his new advisor grew stronger with each passing week, a relationship built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared secret. He began to rely on her judgment not just for security matters, but for the moral direction of his business, finding that her perspective brought a much-needed humanity to his cold calculations. She reminded him of the people who lived in the shadows of his empire, the families who were affected by his decisions, and the importance of maintaining a code of honor, even in a world of crime. Under her influence, the organization began to change, moving away from mindless violence and toward a more strategic, community-focused approach that earned the boss a new kind of respect in the city. The maid had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had saved more than just one man's life. She had saved his soul from the hardening effects of absolute power. Months later, as the first snow of winter began to fall over the estate, the boss and his advisor stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights below twinkled like a sea of diamonds, a reminder of the vast world they were now responsible for protecting. The boss looked at the woman beside him, her face serene and confident in the moonlight, and he realized that he had never been more secure in his life. The threat of the bomb was a distant memory, but the lesson it taught remained at the forefront of his mind, that the greatest strength is often found in the most unexpected places. The maid, now a woman of influence and power, looked out at the horizon and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She had started as a ghost in the halls, a shy woman in a blue dress who knew the secrets of a foreign tongue, and she had become the heart of a new kind of empire. She knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges and that the peace they had built was fragile, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, and she would use it to ensure that the darkness never again went unchallenged. The moral takeaway was clear to both of them. Innocence is not a weakness, and those who are overlooked are often the ones who hold the key to survival. As they turned to go back inside, the boss placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of partnership that spoke of a future defined by trust and redemption. The story of the shy maid who heard the guards speaking Chinese had become a legend within the walls of the mansion, a modern parable of courage and the transformative power of a single, well-timed warning. In the end, it was not the guards' weapons or the boss's money that changed the world, but the quiet integrity of a woman who chose to speak when the world expected her to stay silent.